They walked into battle half naked and expected to survive. While the rest of the ancient world trusted bronze and iron to protect them, the Spartans trusted something far stronger themselves. To an outsider, their appearance on the battlefield seemed insane. Bare legs exposed, minimal armor, and a single crimson cloak fluttering in the wind. But behind that simplicity was a philosophy so profound, so ruthless, that it made them almost untouchable. For the Spartans, armor was not strength, it was dependence, and dependence was weakness. Their entire society was built on the idea that the human body, when trained to its limits, could become harder than steel and more reliable than any shield. They didn't reject armor because they couldn't afford it. They rejected it because they believed it dulled the warrior's spirit. A true Spartan didn't need protection. He was protection. From childhood, they had been trained to think this way. The agoge, that brutal system that began when they were 7 years old, taught them that pain was nothing more than a test and that comfort was the enemy of endurance. While other Greek cities taught their sons to fight with armor, Sparta taught its sons to fight without fear. When a Spartan faced the enemy, he didn't hide behind plates of metal. He stood tall, his skin marked by years of scars, and his muscles carved from endless discipline. His body was his armor, his courage his shield, and his brothers beside him his only line of defense. The crimson cloak each warrior wore was not decoration. It was a symbol, a declaration that they didn't fear death. The color was chosen not for beauty, but for blood. Red concealed wounds. It told the enemy that a Spartan did not show weakness even when bleeding. It also reminded every soldier that once the battle began, there was no turning back. They were already painted with the color of sacrifice. In the scorching light of the Mediterranean sun, their bronze shields shone like mirrors, but the rest of their armor was deliberately minimal. Many fought bare-chested, wearing only leather straps to hold their cloaks, their bodies glistening with sweat and dust. Their legs were uncovered, their sandals thin, and yet they stood firm against armies wrapped in full metal. This wasn't recklessness, it was design. The lighter they were, the faster they could move, and the longer they could fight. A Spartan didn't believe in wasting energy on protection. He believed in precision. Their training turned them into living weapons, every movement measured, every breath controlled, every strike deliberate. Their formation, the Phalanx, was their true armor. Dozens of men stood side by side, shields overlapping, spears thrusting in unison. Alone, a Spartan was mortal. Together, they were indestructible. The Phalanx wasn't just a tactic, it was the physical embodiment of their society. Each man was responsible for the one next to him. If he broke formation, even for a second, it could mean the death of everyone. That's why cowardice was the ultimate sin in Sparta. It wasn't simply fear, it was betrayal. When mothers sent their sons to war, they handed them their shields and said, "Come back with it, or on it." The meaning was clear. Return victorious or die with honor. Losing your shield meant you had abandoned your brothers, and that was a fate worse than death. Every scratch on that round bronze shield told a story. It carried the weight of generations, the sweat of fathers and grandfathers who had stood in the same line facing impossible odds. And though their shields were heavy, their hearts were light, because they had already accepted what most men feared, that death in service to Sparta was not an end, but a beginning. The armor of other soldiers was designed to protect the body. The Spartan code was designed to protect the soul. They believed that fear of death was the heaviest burden a warrior could carry, so they stripped themselves of it, along with anything else that might slow them down. Their training made them immune to panic. From the moment they entered the agoge, they learned to fight under exhaustion, hunger, and pain. They were whipped, starved, frozen, and humiliated, until nothing could break their focus. By the time they reached the battlefield, the chaos of war felt almost calm in comparison. Even their weapons were an extension of that philosophy. The Spartan spear was longer and heavier than most, designed for thrusting through enemy lines with precision. Their swords, shorter and sharper, were used only when the distance closed because, in close combat, hesitation meant death. But more terrifying than their weapons was their silence. Other armies shouted and chanted as they charged. Spartans advanced in eerie calm. Their discipline was absolute. They didn't scream, they breathed in unison. They didn't boast, they stared straight ahead, eyes unblinking. The silence alone could shatter the courage of those who faced them. They had no illusions about glory. To them, battle wasn't theater. It was routine. They didn't fight for trophies or gold. They fought to maintain the order of their world, a world where only the strong, the disciplined, and the fearless deserved to survive. That mindset made them unstoppable, but it also made them distant from everything else. In choosing strength, they had given up gentleness. In choosing discipline, they had sacrificed freedom. But for the Spartans, that trade was worth it. They believed that freedom was not the right to do as one pleased, but the power to do what was necessary. Even their kings lived by the same code. When King Leonidas led his 300 soldiers into Thermopylae, he didn't wear a golden crown or royal armor. He wore the same red cloak as his men, the same sandals, and carried the same shield. To him, leadership meant sharing the same risks, not hiding behind privilege. When foreign envoys mocked them for their lack of armor, Leonidas answered simply, "The man who wears too much protection admits he fears too much pain." For the Spartans, fear was the only enemy worth destroying because once fear was gone, nothing else mattered. It's easy, from the comfort of the modern world, to see their choices as madness. But in their eyes, it was the only way to live. A man protected by armor was just a man. A man protected by his will was something greater, something untouchable. Their entire civilization revolved around that belief. From birth, they were told that their lives belonged to Sparta, and from that moment onward, their only purpose was to be worthy of it. To fear death was to insult the city that had given them life. And so, they trained until their hearts beat in rhythm with the march of their brothers, until their skin felt like armor, until even the gods seemed to admire their endurance. When the time came to fight, they didn't pray for victory. They didn't ask for mercy. They only asked for one thing: to die well. As the sun rose over the mountains of Laconia, its light revealed a sea of bronze and flesh. The Spartans stood in formation, silent and motionless, their red cloaks rippling in the morning wind like banners of defiance. They were surrounded by enemies who outnumbered them many times over, armies covered head to toe in metal helmets gleaming, breastplates shining, shields tall as doors. To anyone watching, the Spartans must have looked exposed, vulnerable, almost naked. But in truth, they were the most protected men on the field. Their armor wasn't made of bronze. It was made of discipline. Each man trusted the one beside him more than he trusted steel. Their shields overlapped like scales, forming a living wall of unity. Their spears angled forward in perfect alignment, not a single movement wasted. They had trained for this moment their entire lives, not to look strong, but to become strength itself. When the enemy advanced, shouting and roaring, the Spartans didn't respond. They held their ground, unmoving, letting the noise wash over them like waves against stone. They waited until the last possible moment, until the enemy was close enough to see the calm in their eyes. Then, as one, they stepped forward, their shields crashing together with a single thunderous sound that shook the battlefield. That was the sound of control, the heartbeat of Sparta. What the world never understood was that the Spartans' lack of armor wasn't arrogance, it was calculation. Heavier armor might protect a man, but it slowed him down, drained his energy, and blinded him to what mattered most: awareness. The Spartans fought in a tight rhythm, where every breath and every step had a purpose. To be weighed down by metal was to risk breaking that rhythm, and to break rhythm was to invite death. Their bodies, hardened by decades of training, could take punishment that would cripple ordinary men. Every scar on their skin was proof of survival. They knew exactly how far their muscles could stretch, how long they could fight before exhaustion set in, and how to push beyond it. Pain was no longer a signal to stop, it was a reminder to focus. In the heat of battle, their formation, the Phalanx, moved like a living machine. Each soldier's shield covered not only himself, but half the man beside him. That meant survival was never an individual act, it was shared. The man on your right protected you, and you protected the man on your left. If one fell, the chain broke, and the formation collapsed. That's why desertion was unthinkable, not because it was cowardly, but because it betrayed the bond that kept everyone alive. Their shield, then, was more sacred than any piece of armor. The breastplate guarded only one man. The shield guarded them all. Even in death, the shield defined them. A Spartan who lost it in battle wasn't just shamed, he was erased. To drop your shield meant you had chosen self-preservation over unity, and that was unforgivable. That was why Spartan mothers said, "Come back with your shield," or "on it." It wasn't poetry, it was law. The Phalanx demanded trust, and that trust was absolute. There was no room for hesitation, no space for ego. The line moved forward as one mind, one will. If the enemy broke through, the Spartans didn't scatter. They adjusted, rotated, and countered with precision born from endless repetition. Their training was so deeply ingrained that it became instinct. They didn't need commands or signals. They simply knew. The sound of battle around them was chaos, swords clashing, men screaming, shields splintering. Yet within the Spartan line there was only order. Each step forward was deliberate. Each thrust of the spear calculated. When an enemy struck, the blow met not fear but resistance. A shield raised, a counterstrike delivered with surgical precision. The heat, the dust, and the blood didn't distract them. They had fought in worse conditions. They had starved for days, marched for weeks, trained in storms, and slept on ice. War was nothing more than a familiar test, another chance to prove that pain could not touch them. Observers from other Greek cities often describe Spartan warriors as if they were possessed. They didn't fight with fury or desperation, but with something colder and more terrifying purpose. It wasn't rage that drove them, it was clarity. The agoge had taught them to separate emotion from action, to strip away hesitation until only discipline remained. That discipline gave them an edge no armor could provide. Where other soldiers grew heavy and slow beneath their plates, the Spartans moved like wind striking, retreating, reforming, advancing again. They didn't rely on defense because they didn't intend to be hit. Their bodies were their weapons, honed through years of relentless hardship. Their movements were clean, efficient, almost beautiful in their precision. Each muscle knew its task, each heartbeat followed rhythm, and every fiber of their being existed for one purpose: to hold the line. It wasn't uncommon for a Spartan warrior to fight until his body failed completely. Wounds that would have killed others were ignored, dismissed as mere inconvenience. The will was stronger than the flesh. And if a Spartan fell, he fell facing the enemy, never turning his back, never surrendering. Even their enemies, the Persians, feared their resolve. At Thermopylae, the sight of 300 Spartans standing unflinching against tens of thousands of men broke morale before the first arrow was even fired. The Persians were armored head to toe, yet they hesitated because they saw something in the eyes of the Spartans that they didn't understand: peace. To stand in the face of death without fear, that was the truest armor of all. When the first waves of arrows darkened the sky, the Spartans raised their shields, not in panic, but in rhythm, covering the line perfectly. Arrows bounced off bronze, off flesh, off discipline itself. When the reign of iron ended, they reformed instantly and advanced, their footsteps in unison like the tolling of a great bell. Theirs was a kind of faith not in gods or destiny, but in preparation. They didn't hope for survival. They knew they would survive or die while trying. Even in training, their instructors repeated a simple truth: armor can rust, steel can break, but willpower endures. That was the creed that replaced their fear. The reason they wore so little into battle was because they refused to believe anything external could protect them better than their own discipline. A man who relied on armor to stay alive, they said, would die the moment his armor failed him. The greatest warriors of Sparta learned to see themselves as part of a greater body, the body of Sparta itself. The city had no walls because the men were the walls. Their bodies, their courage, their discipline, these were the fortifications that guarded the land. And when they died, they didn't see it as loss. They saw it as contribution, one brick removed from the wall. to be replaced by another. That was the power of their unity, and the secret of why they never needed armor. It wasn't about invincibility. It was about belief. The unshakable conviction that strength was something internal, not external. In every battle they proved it again and again. They didn't outnumber their enemies. They didn't out-equip them. But they outlasted them, because while others fought to survive, Spartans fought to fulfill their purpose. When the battle ended, the field was silent. The air hung heavy with the scent of iron and smoke, and beneath the rising sun, the ground shimmered with bronze shields and crimson cloaks stained darker by blood. The Spartans stood among the fallen, breathing steadily, eyes cold and unshaken. Around them lay enemies who had once mocked their lack of armor, men who had hidden behind plates of metal and towers of shields, now broken and scattered across the dust. For the Spartans, this was not victory, it was proof. Proof that their way of life, their belief in discipline over protection, had triumphed once again. The battle was never about land or power. It was about endurance, about showing that a human being stripped of everything could still stand tall. They cleaned their weapons in silence, wiped the blood from their faces, and gathered their dead. There was no celebration, no song, no boastful cheer. Victory was expected. Survival was the only honor worth earning. In Sparta, they didn't need monuments to remember their heroes. The city itself was the monument, a living temple to discipline and courage. Its walls were not made of stone, but of men who had learned to replace fear with purpose. Their training, their scars, their silence. These were the foundations upon which Sparta stood. When a Spartan boy entered the agoge, he was taught that armor protects the body, but only willpower protects the soul. That lesson followed him to the battlefield, into every movement, every strike, every breath. By the time he reached adulthood, he no longer needed bronze between him and death. His skin had become a shield, his mind an unbreakable fortress. To modernize, this might seem cruel, a society built entirely on sacrifice and suffering. But to the Spartans, it was liberation. To live without armor was to live without dependence. To live without fear was to live without limits. They believed that courage was not the absence of danger, but the refusal to let danger define you. Every battle, every wound, every loss was another opportunity to prove that principle. The armorless body of a Spartan was more than flesh. It was a declaration of mastery over pain. And while other civilizations chased comfort and beauty, Sparta chased clarity. Their beauty lay in simplicity, in the symmetry of their formation, in the rhythm of their march, in the silence before impact. They didn't see war as chaos, but as order revealed through struggle. That's why they trained endlessly, not just to fight, but to endure. A Spartan didn't measure victory by who struck hardest, but by who stood longest. Endurance was their religion, and self-control their god. There's a story told by later Greek writers about a Spartan who was struck in the chest during battle, the wound deep and fatal. As he fell, he smiled and said, "I was already ready." That was the essence of Sparta, the readiness to die without regret, to meet death as an old companion rather than an enemy. Their enemies couldn't understand it. How could men fight without fear? How could they charge into death with calm faces and silent steps? The answer was simple. They had already died 1,000 times before. Every punishment in the agoge, every freezing night, every drop of blood spilled in training, it was all preparation. They didn't remove armor from their bodies. They removed it from their minds. They had learned to carry their protection within them. Even centuries after their fall, their philosophy continued to echo through history. The Romans studied their tactics. Philosophers studied their discipline. And soldiers, even in the modern world, still whisper their name with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Spartan became not just a word, but an ideal, a symbol of what human beings can become when they decide that nothing external defines their strength. Their legacy wasn't their victories or their empire, those faded with time. What endured was the idea that the body can be weak, but the mind can be infinite. That no armor, no weapon, no wall could ever match the power of will. Even their deaths were lessons. At Thermopylae, when King Leonidas and his 300 stood against a sea of Persian soldiers, they didn't expect to win, they expected to endure. When the arrows blotted out the sun, they laughed and said, "Then we shall fight in the shade." That wasn't arrogance, it was enlightenment. They had transcended fear. They no longer needed armor because they no longer needed safety. Safety was for those who feared loss. The Spartans had already given up everything except their purpose. To understand them is to confront an uncomfortable truth about ourselves, that our search for comfort has made us fragile. We build walls, armor, and excuses to protect ourselves from pain, forgetting that pain is the forge where strength is born. The Spartans remind us that what makes us powerful is not what shields us, but what we can endure when the shields are gone. If a Spartan could see the modern world, he might not understand our weapons, our machines, or our luxuries, but he would recognize our fears, the same ones he was taught to destroy. And perhaps he would smile, not in pride, but in pity. Because he knew a secret that we have forgotten, that the only real armor is the will to keep moving forward, even when everything else has been stripped away. In their philosophy, there was beauty in vulnerability. The body, exposed and mortal, was a reminder that life itself was temporary, but what one does with that life could become eternal. They accepted death not as an end, but as proof of mastery over fear. To die well was to live completely. That's why the image of a bare-chested Spartan standing against the storm still resonates after thousands of years. It's not just history, it's a mirror. It reflects what humanity is capable of when it stops running from pain and starts embracing it. They didn't need armor because they had already built it not of metal, but of conviction. And when the cold wind howled across the mountains of Thermopylae, when the last Spartan drew his final breath surrounded by enemies, he didn't curse his fate. He didn't pray for mercy. He stood as long as his body allowed, defiant until the very end. Because to the Spartans, death was never defeat. It was simply the last lesson to prove, once and for all, that true strength doesn't need protection. And maybe that's the lesson they left us. That you don't need armor to be unbreakable. You just need the courage to stand your ground, even when the world tells you to fall.